Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. I'm by myself today, no co-host, but I have a marvelous guest. I have John Carroll, who is the chair of the Vermont Board of Education. John, welcome to the show. So good to see you. It's been a while.
As indeed.
Yes. I was hoping you'd wear the jacket. My husband says, I remember a jacket that John wore, oh my God, 25 years ago.
It was Howard's inaugural.
Was it Howard's? Oh, but I loved it because I wanted it. So Bruce said, why did you remember that? I said, because I wanted the jacket. It was an Irish, it must have had some history to it.
It did. It was sort of modeled after the Beatles stand-up collar jacket.
Oh,
remember that?
right.
And we had it made before our wedding.
Oh.
So that, and it was called Tail Feathers, and it had sort of bows on the back.
Yeah, bows all over the place,
it was
right?
Deep navy velvet.
Right, it was fabulous.
Quite flashy.
I remember these things, it was great. Anyway, welcome to the show, and we usually ask people to talk a little bit about themselves before we get into the meat of the discussion, and we're very fortunate. I watched it at home, and John was in the State House to hear the governor's State of the State, and a few little protests here and there. So we have many things to talk about, but maybe you could chat a little bit about your history.
Well, I guess in Vermont, when I moved here 45 years ago, I became just instinctively involved in community service, serving as the listers and that sort of thing.
Right.
And then one day, a friend of mine who was our representative in the House, Jack Candon.
Oh my, we know.
Lovely guy,
yes.
Old friend. Brought me with him for a day up to the State House. And I was just smitten. I thought, wow, this looks like fun.
Right.
I live in Norwich, probably one of the most ardently Democrat towns in Vermont.
Yes, it is, yes.
When the Republican caucus, and I am Republican, when the caucus convenes, we use the local phone booth. There's that many of us.
Yes, right, exactly.
Anyway, so it was very clear that I couldn't get elected to the House from Norwich.
Right.
So I thought, oh, what the heck? I'll just run for the state Senate because there are 24 towns and there must be some Republicans among them.
Right.
And it turns out I got elected. So,
that's great.
So I served for 3 terms, in the last term I became majority leader and chair of appropriations. We created a Republican majority for the first time in many years.
Great.
And that was a lot of fun. Those were the days when...
You were chair of appropriations, that's huge.
Yeah, and majority leader was a lot going on.
Good deal.
And Ralph Wright was speaker, so we did a lot of that. But it was a kind of friendly engagement and contest, perhaps a little less divisive. Today, the governor spoke about divisiveness in public affairs.
It's gotten bad.
Tez, and I'm sure it's not so much fun as it was in those days.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Some days I think maybe I don't want to be there because it's really bad. It's very difficult. He was talking about finding the middle. Where is the middle? It's gone. It's gone.
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah,
it's hard. But so many years back in the private sector, and then the governor asked me to serve on the State Board of Education.
Great.
And after 2 years or so, I became the chair of the board. It's a 6-year term.
Yep.
I've agreed to serve 1 term. I'd like to get done what I intend to get done in 1 term. I'm getting old, and I've got 9 grandchildren, and there are other things
bless
in life.
you. That's great. I only have 4. You're up ahead of me. Well, as long as you're saying what you'd like to get done, I'll kind of skip ahead in the questions. What is that vision that you'd like to get done in 6 years?
Well, what I noticed when I first came, like all of us, I've been on lots and lots of boards.
Right.
And there are effective boards and there are ineffective boards. I was shocked when I came to the state board to find that the board was spending a huge amount of time kind of looking over the shoulder of the Secretary of Education. And many board members still imagined that they were in charge of education. They didn't get the memo that about 6 years ago, the legislature decided that the Board of Education would no longer direct the Commissioner of Education.
Right.
They created a secretary. The secretary reports to the governor. And that sort of left the Board of Education sort of, well, now what do we do?
Because back then, you used to be able to appoint the chair, right?
We appointed the commissioner.
The commissioner.
And he answered to the board.
Right.
They
So that's
were
a
the
big
board of
change for you.
directors of the agents, or
Right.
the then Department of Education.
Right,
The legislature, in its wisdom, changed that in 2012,
right,
something called Act 98. There had been governors for years, Governor Douglas and then Governor Shumlin, had advocated that the head of education should answer to the governor
right,
for policy coherence and all that. So the board for 100 years had been in charge of education, and then suddenly it stopped. I think the board was kind of slow to pick up on that memo, and so what I'm hoping to do, and what the board is really, I think, really has consensus to do, is to move forward and complete what was started 6 years ago
right.
with the separation of these two entities. And so we are proposing, or advocating, not proposing, but advocating legislation to complete the separation of the agency and the board. It'll be better for the agency because they spend a lot of time
Right.
kind of going through the hoops
Yes,
that statute still requires them to do, but frankly, the board's not adding any value.
yeah,
The board is spending a lot of its time micromanaging and looking over the shoulder of the secretary, and if I were he, I would hate that. And he's been fairly clear about that.
He really
I
does
don't blame
hate
him.
it. Yeah, right.
And he reminds the board every once in a while, I don't answer to you. And the board says, oh, yeah, well, we'll tell you what we think anyway. And you kind of have to wonder, what's the point of all that? And moreover, because we're so engaged in this sort of tactical and operational detail, we very rarely stand back and look at the big picture. And the vision I have for the board is that we need to be kind of up on the hillside and peering over the horizon and see beyond the horizon, see 10, 20 years ahead.
wow,
Because nobody else does that.
Yep.
And the board could leverage its power to convene to do that sort of
Right.
thing. And not that we should or would define what should happen, but rather that we should bring information and perspective to the policymakers in the state, who are primarily the legislature.
right,
And in that way, I want the board to become kind of an impartial observer and a reliable
Good.
conveyor of trusted information to the General Assembly, to the governor, to the secretary. But to do that, we need to clear the table of all the administrivia that were involved and open up the space to begin to focus on bigger picture issues.
And I know we were talking a little bit before when I worked at the Department of Ed as a deputy, and I was shocked by the amount of time that department spends for your meetings.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they had tables set up in the hall for all of the deciding on what to give you and what attachments and stuff. And
yeah.
I mean, if you hit the table, they just about kill you if you disturbed anything. It was a
Right.
big deal.
It was.
I'm like, come on, people.
And that was back when the board actually was in charge.
Right, right.
A
yeah.
lot of that still happens, and the board's not in charge. So we're basically consuming, I think we're consuming 2 or 3 full-time employees of the agencies.
Yeah, for sure.
And we're proposing to kind of let them go. They shouldn't have to take care of us anymore.
Right.
And there are a lot of good reasons to do that, partly because it's a consumption of their talents and their time. And second, frankly, if we ever, on the board, wanted to look at the agency critically, and we might
Yeah,
sometime,
right.
we can't get staffed. I mean,
There you go.
understandably,
Right.
the secretary would say, oh, you want to investigate my department of this and that?
Right.
I don't think I've got any people available for
Right,
that.
exactly.
I would say the same thing. So we need to move toward having our own
That's
our
great.
own
I like the way you're
autonomous
saying this.
staffing. Not because that's the major thing we want to be doing,
Yeah.
but rather because we're tying up agency time and talent, and the board has for years been kind of overly influenced by the Agency of Education.
They've pretty much set the agenda
They do.
back then.
They do.
And it's like a magic bell. If you want to ask a question, oh, I'm sorry, I'm doing the board. And then you, oh, okay,
Right,
sorry, I won't talk to you.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, I thought it was, I'm glad to hear that maybe that's changing, which is a very good thing
Well,
for everybody.
I think it's going to change
Yeah.
as we move forward. I
Yeah.
think the board's becoming more autonomous.
Good. Because you've got some great members.
Yeah.
I know Peter Peltz,
Yeah.
Oliver Olson.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
And I'm trying to remember, I don't know some of the people, but their names
Yeah,
aren't familiar to
yeah.
me, but you've got some great people
Yeah,
on
we
the
do,
board.
we do. And there's a consensus on the board that we need to sort of figure out who we want to be when we grow up.
Right,
And we need to complete what was started 6 years ago.
yeah.
And a lot of that is just legislative cleanup.
Well, except you now have responsibility, which I think is amazing, for special ed. And I think you should, if you could talk a little bit about that, because if there's an area that needs to be addressed, while still maintaining the support for the students, for sure, but it needs a little fine tuning, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the legislature, in its considerable wisdom in this case, passed Act 173 2 years ago, founded on research and a lot of very valuable research done by UVM and other places, that showed that the way we're doing special education, the way we're funding it in Vermont, is probably counterproductive. And also the way we were funding it unintentionally forces certain behaviors in the schools, which are not best practices in special ed. And so out of that came Act 173, and the real work of rewriting the rules and redesigning on that falls to the Agency of Education, because it's a lot of particular detail.
Yep.
And also the legislature created something called the Census-Based Funding Advisory Group, which is a whole bunch of stakeholders,
Yeah.
and charges them with the authority to advise the agency and the board about the new rules.
Oh, okay. And for special ed specifically?
For special
or,
ed
okay.
especially.
And that's that Troy McAllister?
No, that's a different group.
Oh, that's a different.
That's an
Sorry.
inside the agency group that
Oh.
frankly has been, until recently, not very visible and kind of moribund. I have worked very hard to kind of get them involved so that we hear from them.
Yeah.
But the lead group on this is this Census-Based Funding Advisory Group, a woman named Megan Roy, who was from South Burlington area, is the chair. And that group's very effective because it brings together all of the major stakeholders.
Right, good.
And they have been very critical of some of the proposed rules that the agency has proposed. And to the agency's credit, they have responded to those criticisms and modified the rules so that the two sides, they come at this from very different perspectives. And the two sides are finding, I think, a constructive middle ground. And the state board sort of oversees this because ultimately they are our rules. We have the authority
I was
to
going to say,
adopt
you
those
have,
rules.
you were granted rulemaking authority,
Right.
which is good.
Right, that gives us essentially final say
Right.
on the rules, and basically our position so far has been to say to both sides, you guys sit down and negotiate an agreement and let us know if you're both signed on to it.
Things have certainly changed since I've been there, because when I asked to do the job, I sat down, I have no life, I read all of the statutes regarding education, and what I noticed is there's no authority. Back then, there was very little authority in the department and in the board. It just, you do this and that, but if somebody doesn't want to do it, you didn't didn't have something to encourage them, except for funding. Funding was the only mechanism that the commissioner or secretary now would have, and I thought, well, that's kind of strange.
Yeah.
Especially for education, you know.
Well, it's a little bit like trying to figure out what's happening in the U.S. Department of Defense or something. I mean, it's a very...
Well, and it had to do with local control, and you can't step
Yeah.
on local control, so that's a dynamic that's the problem.
extraordinarily complex. I
Right.
think the whole education scene in Vermont is so different than, say, social welfare
Right.
or the Agency of Transportation or banking and finance. They are all pretty
For
centralized.
sure, right?
But the vast majority of people who are actually delivering education, the 8,000 teachers in
Right.
Vermont, they're all local folks.
Right.
And we have this powerful tradition of local control in Vermont.
Right. Well, and I must say, I talked to them. I was on the Bill Sayer show this morning, and I was talking about the police and through the opioid crisis, how their jobs have changed to be social workers, to deal with mental health, to deal with opioids, obviously. And then we switched to education, and I said, you know, I'm realizing teachers'
Oh.
jobs have completely changed, just like the police. Because they're
Absolutely.
dealing with the exact same
Yes,
things.
they are. They are.
I mean, it's just, you go to college to learn to teach, and then you're faced with all these issues. It's really
it's
difficult.
a much tougher job. My mom was a fourth grade
Oh, I
teacher,
see.
bless her heart, and two of my children are teachers, and
Nice.
it's a very different world
Yeah.
than when us old folks were going through it.
Yeah.
And so, teachers have only so many
Right.
hours in the day, and the schools do have resource officers and
Yeah.
social work staff, but the schools are called upon
Yeah.
to do
Yeah.
things that 50 years ago they were never asked to
thought
do.
about it.
So-
And they send kids home to environments that maybe are not so great, and they know the kid's going to
Right.
come back the next
Right.
day with the exact same
Right.
attitude and mindset, and it's pretty sad.
All of that is true, but it's worth noting that we have in Vermont, because of our demographics and history and happenstance, we have a much healthier cadre of students than most states.
Really?
Yeah, Vermont, if you look at all the indicators, Vermont kids are number 3 in the nation in health profiles. We're number 4 in the nation in access to health care for children. Safety in general is much
Wow,
higher.
right.
Poverty levels in Vermont are lower than the national average. So that there are a lot of, and communities are small, and we know
Right,
that small
well,
communities are
right.
kind of better for folks
For
in
sure.
that sense. You don't get lost so easily. So we have a lot of kind of natural advantages so that the children who arrive at our schools, even though a significant percentage of them are disadvantaged,
Mm-hmm.
proportionally, we have less of that to deal with in Vermont
Oh,
than many states.
That's really good to know.
It sort of
Good to
stands
hear.
to reason. I
Yeah.
mean, this is a state that has remained homogeneous in
Right.
many senses for a long time. And so, even though, so for those reasons, some of us feel that we should be expecting very high levels of success and outcomes for our students in our schools because the raw material is comparatively
That's great.
ready to be educated.
Well, that's encouraging, John.
And the truth is, our schools do score well.
Right,
We tend to be in the top 5 to top 10
right.
among all schools, sometimes in the top 5 in terms of testing
Academics,
scores
right,
and so
right.
forth like that. But some of us feel like, why shouldn't we be number 1?
Well, I think from a cost perspective, we have that.
Well, exactly.
And that's why people say, if you're number 1 in cost, why aren't
Why don't
we?
you? It's a fair
yeah,
question,
right.
and I don't have an answer for that, but I
Yeah.
think it's an expectation that's really worth
Right.
discussing more and finding out how do we get there.
Yeah. Are we getting our return on investment?
Well, yeah, I mean, and it's very complicated.
Yeah. Well, yes, I know. But you mentioned the word demographic, and the governor today said at one point that we have a demographic crisis.
It's a good word.
Yeah, I wrote that right down. I was sitting home watching. That's a
Yeah.
great word. So, and you asked to talk about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
What does that have on education? The impact on education and cost?
Well, first of all, I applaud the governor. I mean, for bringing that right up right at the beginning.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
I thought the governor's. If we can just
Oh, yes,
detour for a
please.
moment.
Compliments to the governor are good.
The governor's State of the State
Right.
address today was, to me, very interesting because it began with a tribute, or I think a very heartfelt tribute from the governor to Vermonters who give to their communities
Yes,
with
right.
great generosity.
Yeah.
And this has nothing to do with government. This has to do with being a
People.
Vermonter
Right.
and being a member of your community. And he reminded us all of that's really vital to our
Right.
well-being as a people. And he ended there.
Yes, he did.
He talked about
yeah.
policy and this program and that program. He doubled back in the end and talked again and asked us all to salute
Right.
people who are citizens in our state and who have contributed, some of these being
Yeah.
men who served
Right,
in Europe in
right.
World War II,
Yeah.
bless their hearts, and some who are serving
Well,
in our
the
school.
story about his dad, he's
yeah.
told it once or twice
Yeah.
or more, but it's just so,
Oh, yeah.
oh my God, what
Yeah.
a story he has, and
So-
brought up with his brothers.
Yeah. So I love that the governor who's there to talk about government
Right,
is started and ended by talking about people that has nothing to do with government,
Right.
but is essential to our sense of who
well,
we
I
are.
hope
as
it
a-
diffused something, because we need to get back to the middle, as he suggested. He
Yeah.
said the middle's gone.
Yeah.
And we always used to say, you know, the best bill is the third bill, your bill, my bill, and the compromise bill.
Yes, of course. Of course.
Because we don't have that now at all.
Well, it looks that way from the outside. I reckon if we were inside, we'd see it
I don't know.
more.
Folks
I
who
hope
have
so.
been there have told me,
Really?
yeah,
Okay.
that it's
Pretty odd.
pretty bad.
Well, there's such a significant imbalance between the two parties.
Right,
Which I don't care much about parties, but I do care about the values and perspectives that they bring.
right.
So there's two different sets of values and perspectives, and there's it's a 2-to-1 imbalance.
Right.
More than that in the Senate. It's 4-to-1 in the Senate.
Right, the Senate is bad.
That kind of, you have to say, if we've got 80% of the people, why do we need to even talk with you? I
Right,
mean,
right,
so we could talk about why is that.
But I think
That's
we
another
all
matter.
want the same thing. I mean, you get it wanting, in whatever you believe, you want the best for Vermont. You may believe something different, but you
Right.
you want the best, you
all want
approach it differently.
Right. We all want a growing economy, and some people would say you do it by reducing the regulations and hurdles that get in the
Right,
way of
right.
starting businesses here. And others would say, well, no, we need to spend more money to do
Right,
this and
right.
that. So there's the kind of the government, the activism government solution on the progressive side, and there's the government getting out of the way solution on the traditional Republican side.
Right.
And so it isn't an argument about what are our goals, but
No,
it's
it's
an
how you
argument
get
about
there.
what are our means for getting there. I
Right,
think.
exactly.
So anyway, just to get back to demographics,
Demographics.
yeah, I've been up to the governor's office a couple times lately to talk to his staff about what we're hoping to do with the board. And on a big whiteboard, right behind the reception desk, is a huge set of data about declines in population and so
Yeah,
forth,
yeah.
and school populations. So to go back to the question of why does education cost so much? And
Right.
we do have,
Right.
I think we're the third highest per student cost
Right,
in the
in the
country.
country.
New York is first, New Jersey's second, and we're third.
Right.
We're so different than those
Oh,
states.
exactly.
Anyway, it's when organizations are declining, shrinking, their costs go up.
Sure.
So because you can't get rid of people as fast as you lose customers.
Right.
Well, we're losing customers, i.e. students, at an extraordinary rate. And you can't scale back the size of your organization
Fast
Fast enough.
Right.
and conversely, when you're growing very rapidly, you're usually understaffed because you can't bring on talent enough
Right,
quickly.
right.
So we're just every organization suffers from this, whether it's a corporation or a school system. So we have to understand that this sort of high cost of education has a lot to do with the trajectory of our enrollment, which is downward. And we're always playing catch up. Every school board is faced with a diminished population, and they have to think about, well, when can we let a teacher go? Because we're going to have to.
Right.
And we can't quite do it yet because there's still a half a class, and so that the cost goes up because you're still fully staffed, but you have 5% fewer
Right,
students.
right.
So this whole shrinking dynamic that the governor's talking about, this demographic crisis.
Right.
Young working population is leaving, students are leaving.
Right. And he was saying, on the other side, there's not as many births. So
Right.
people, we don't have the birth rate that we used to have. Right.
You remember Japan went through this demographic crisis with this
Yes.
aging population, and they didn't have enough young people. And America has faced that,
Right.
although that turned around some. But at Vermont, we are still in this kind of a death spiral. It doesn't. And none of us together have figured out. So how would we turn this around?
Right.
I think it's a classic case of if you have a kind of pro-government sentiment, as my Democrat, my left side friends would have, they would say, well, government can do programs to fix this. If you're on my side, you sort of say, it's those government it's high spending. We're a very high tax state.
Right.
We're a very high regulation state. And we understand that to mean that that's why we're shrinking. And the solution is to do less government,
Right.
not more.
Right.
That's just a philosophical argument.
Yes, and then you get into we're the least business-friendly state, and for businesses to come here, you need a really good education system that's not costing a fortune. So lots to think about.
It's there are a lot of challenging forces at work, and the governor's, I think, absolutely correct to remind people that this is this demographic thing is extremely serious.
Yeah. And I know people are probably wondering, are we going to talk about Act 46? Well, we're not, because it's in court now down in Middlebury. I understand January 15th is the date.
That's right.
And is that that's sort of the last hurdle for this?
I guess it's the last stop, yeah. I think it's 26 towns, maybe more now,
Yeah, was
34
this
towns.
the David Kelly?
And have appealed the state board's order.
Right.
And they appealed to Superior Court as is appropriate.
Right.
Superior Courts did not rule in their favor.
Yeah.
And ultimately they appealed to the Vermont State Supreme Court, which is hearing arguments on Wednesday the 15th.
The 15th, right.
Next week. The defendant is the State Board of Education.
Oh, so you will be there.
You're talking
there
to the
you
defendant.
Go, John. Yeah.
And as chair, I don't have to be there because no one's going to be asking us to speak.
Yeah.
But I guess as a courtesy to the court, I think I ought to go.
You're going to have to back up your attorneys there and go. I was thinking of going myself because I'm fascinated
Yeah, I
by
think
the
it
whole.
could be pretty
We've done a
interesting.
lot of coverage of Act 46 on here.
Yep.
And so I'd like to see.
Yeah, I certainly have my views about it all, but I
know you can't do it. No, you can't. So we won't do that. But just so you're wondering, that's why, because there's a reason for this. And then the governor mentioned a couple of things. First of all, he mentioned funding for Cradle to Career, which is, I don't remember the career word, a cradle to grave, I guess is the usual thing. But he said Cradle to Career continuum with helping people get through all the phases of life. And then he said he was going to give, this is really good, money for improved performance, that continuous improvement to keep the Department of Ed getting better every day. And do you work with this is my sister, just so you know, Sue Zeller, who's the performance czar?
Right.
So I don't know if she's worked with the Department of Ed, but she does the performance standards.
Sure. Well, and the governor also made the observation about the very wide variation in the effectiveness of the schools from town to town.
Right.
And that seems to me to be an area where there's a great opportunity to make some significant improvements. I mean, if you think about, this town is educating children pretty successfully for $13,000 a year, and that town's spending $18,000 and not getting any better results.
Right.
You sort of want to say to
those
folks, say, hey, why don't you go see what they're doing? I'll have what she's having, the Harry.
Right.
And sort of, we ought to be, I think, looking at best practices, because there are some schools that are doing extraordinary things with comparatively few resources.
Yeah.
And I don't think we do as much as we could to bring those into focus and to challenge the laggards, if you will. There can't be any excuse for this.
See, I've always, I'm just so brave, I've always disagreed with Brigham, with the legislature. When the Brigham decision came out, everything is supposed to be substantially equal. That's the phrase, right?
That's
substantially equal. The legislature, I think, taking the easy way out, tagged a dollar amount on what substantial. If you all spend $1,000, it'll all be fine. Well, 1,000 in Burlington is not necessarily 1,000 in Norwich or 1,000 in where I come from. And I think it's performance. I think you want the kids to leave. And it doesn't matter about the dollar amount, because you just said they may spend less and have a better outcome.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, agreed. And we were asked by the General Assembly 2 years ago to figure out the metrics for the so-called small schools grant.
Right. Oh, gosh, yes.
And those grants used to be given out just because you were small.
Right.
And the legislature directed us to reconfigure the metrics on that to reflect achievement and excellence, and also to reflect efficiency. And so when then you start looking at the small schools through the lens of how are their outcomes,
Right.
and we came across some schools that were doing
Fabulous.
incredibly wonderful work
Right.
with very little money, and you just have to say, wow, how do they do that? And whatever it is they're doing it, we should bottle it
Yeah.
and spread it around.
Right.
And so we set it up so that those kind of schools would be rewarded. So you get a reward for, you got to be small, but you get a reward for excellence and efficiency.
Yeah.
And equity as well.
Yeah.
Some of these small schools were doing a fabulous job with their disadvantaged children.
Yeah.
You could look at the scores of disadvantaged kids and advantaged children, and you couldn't see any difference.
Right.
And you have to say, wow, that's a masterful achievement. And equity ought to be very important
That's
to
great.
us.
Yeah. I've always wanted somebody to sue and to change that dynamic of dollars, but nobody has.
Well, just if I may, the weighting study that you have heard has just
yes,
come
right.
out.
Yeah.
People have been waiting for that for some
Right.
time. And the weighting study gives legislators a national perspective about how other states do their weighting. Just to clarify for people, what the weighting is about is to say that some students are more expensive to serve well than others.
For sure.
And if the child is from an economically disadvantaged situation, it's probably going to cost more to bring that child up to the same level
Yep.
as a child from an advantaged situation.
Right.
Similarly, a child who has English as a second language, and certainly a child who has special needs. So this weighting study recognizes that you ought to provide funding to the towns based upon the characteristics of their student body.
That's great.
And it's not the same in every town. And rural towns often have higher rates of need, that is,
Yep.
greater poverty levels, because their housing costs are lower, so people whose resources are limited tend to live in towns like that.
Yeah.
So the weighting study would change the way we equalize significantly.
Wow.
And if the legislature follows through with it, and there's no telling what will happen, the weighting study would in effect shift more resources to the rural areas that
Great.
have the greatest needs.
Great.
per-
And that's
per
that's
student.
available now up in
Yeah, the weighting study just was released about 2 weeks ago,
Okay.
and I'm sure the money committees and the education committees will be spending a lot of
Great,
time
I have to
grappling
get
with
that.
it. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
something to
that sounds
follow.
interesting. We're going to do something with that.
Yeah.
So besides the money, my other thing, he said he was giving 1.5 million to Tech Ed, which I told you, I think Tech Ed is the way
Yep,
to go for
yep.
the state.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I was deputy, I brought in a whole bunch of employers to meet with people from the department, and they were begging for Tech Ed students.
Yes.
There's not first of all, it's 2 years, not 4. So there's obviously, it's less money, there's less debt. And when you walk out of school, you get a darn good job, which, I mean, plumbing is not going out of style. We'll have plumbing available.
I hope we have
for the
indoor
rest
plumbing
of
for a
us.
long time.
Exactly.
Right.
So there's the career trades that you learn are things that will be here.
Yeah, yeah.
They're not going anywhere.
Yeah, I just got a call yesterday from a fellow who's had a career in fiber optics.
Oh, that's huge.
And it's the way we get our
For
information.
sure, right.
And he was raising questions about whether or not our tech schools are providing training for electricians and others in fiber optics, because running a fiber optic cable ain't the same as running a copper cable.
No, right,
Very, very
right.
different. And it's a great point. We need to have the technology
Yeah.
updated all the time. You know, I think we have a pretty strong tech ed program.
Oh, we do. I love it.
Our regional school system. There are, though, some as I understand it, there are some financial obstacles in the sense that when a high school student leaves the high
Yes,
school to
money,
go there,
money goes with them.
the money goes with them.
And that
so,
school's unhappy.
and the school tries to hang on
Yep.
to them. And that shouldn't be.
No.
And so I hope the legislature, that's
Yeah,
not for the
they've-
board to deal with, but I do hope the legislature can come to grapple
Well,
with
I
that.
was so excited last year to hear them talking about it, and we went in to testify a couple of times, campaigned for Vermont. I'm
Yeah.
a registered lobbyist now.
Oh, you
I've
are?
gone down to the...
Wow.
Exactly.
You have no pride.
I know, exactly. I've given up the ghost. But anyway, just to hear them talking about tech ed, I was surprised. And now, high schools, you can dual enrollment, you can
Yeah.
enroll in tech ed,
Yeah,
and you can enroll in college courses.
Yeah.
And so we've answered, I knew some people years ago who their children were literally smarter than, I don't know whether they were genius, and that was a problem for them in the high school because, and in
They have
all the
AP
schools,
courses and,
yeah, we kind of leaned towards the special ed kids, the kids in need, which we needed to, but we forgot about the kids who have their hands raised all the time.
Sure.
And they were bored and you know, they get themselves into trouble sometimes and
Right.
they needed to be stimulated. And I think when I gave you a list of,
Yeah.
they call it flexible pathways
Yeah.
now, where there's all of this dual enrollment, early college, personalized learning. They really,
Proficiency-based learning is
yes, they
a huge
really
challenge.
focus on the child and what the child needs. And how great is that?
Yeah, I think it's quite different
Yeah.
than our time,
Yes.
and it's probably long overdue.
Yeah.
Where the board is conducting a kind of an inquiry into proficiency-based learning
Excellent.
just to understand it better and how well it's going. You know, every time the legislature or the board, for that matter, creates a new initiative like dual enrollment or what have
Right.
you, you know, the idea is good, and we get it maybe 80% right or
Right.
95% right, but it's almost impossible to get it really right the first time.
Right.
You got to put it out there, let it run for a couple of years, and then you need to do some fine tuning.
Yeah, right.
And so I think people are agreeing that there's definitely fine tuning that needs to be done. Well, with dual enrollment, an example of what's a little problematic there is that children from disadvantaged homes participate in dual enrollment much less than ordinary kids.
Uh-huh.
And it's a resource challenge. The average Vermont kid might have an old clunker car to drive,
Transportation.
but a lot of kids don't.
Yeah,
An average Vermont kid might have had a parent who's gone to college.
right.
Disadvantaged kids, that may not be so
Right.
common. So the availability, for practical purposes, the availability of dual enrollment
there.
for disadvantaged youngsters
Yeah.
is not as robust as it ought to be.
Yeah.
Similarly, on proficiency-based learning, again, a major initiative. There are many, many people, especially in the education community, think it's a terrific improvement, very
Right.
personalized, creates incentives for kids to get engaged who otherwise were sort of tuned out. But you hear a lot of parents concerned about the transcript that's coming out of this because
Right.
they're changing the grading system, and you read U32 had quite a kerfuffle.
Oh,
about,
yes, well, that's
about-
ours here.
yeah. So it's clearly a good initiative. I would hate to see it get thrown overboard simply because there have been
Yeah.
some unintended
I would
consequences.
just hope they let it sit for a while and make those tweaks
Make some
because
tweaks.
when I was in there, every couple of years, somebody came out with, the feds came out with some new initiative, and we never ever gave the current initiative
Yep.
time to work.
Yeah.
And these schools, how they would do a 380 on another one,
Yeah.
and they had to learn it, and
Yeah.
they bought supplies,
Yeah.
and
The Vermont
Give-
schools suffer from this initiative
Oh,
overload.
yes, just give them reading, writing, and arithmetic. Just
Yeah.
do it.
We take up an awful lot of
I
professional
agree.
time from
Yeah.
teachers just to deal with the newest. I think the legislature's sort of come to understand that.
Yeah.
Both the House and Senate Committees on Education have both said, we're not interested in doing some grand new initiative.
right.
I do hope that they might be interested in some fine tuning or some
Well,
additional
that's
resourcing.
what they should do.
Yeah.
I mean, you give yourself maybe maybe as much as 10 years with tweaking along the way, and if it doesn't work, well, then you know you've given it a good try. But I remember there was 2 or 3 completely different initiatives over the years. I'm like, how can they deal with this?
Yeah.
I mean, the teachers need a little thing to just kind of know what they're going to do every year and
Yeah.
not learn something completely different.
Right.
It's crazy.
Right.
So then the governor, you had a busy day, John. He mentioned this after network enrichment programs.
Yeah. After school.
After school network enrichment programs where the school day would be extended to as much as the work day. I actually think could have some serious possibilities. I hope you do too.
I do. I
I'm
was
like,
very
oh
excited.
my God, what a deal for everybody, for the parents who have to pay for, this state charges so much for daycare. When I came here from New York, my daughter was in daycare. I was a single parent, divorced, and when I came up here and found out what they were paying for daycare, it's much more than what we were paying in New York in Tarrytown.
Really?
I was surprised. I was like, why bother, you know?
Yeah. I was very excited to hear what the governor was
Yeah,
proposing.
yeah.
I haven't, frankly, any idea how to make it happen. But, you know, one thing that's worth thinking about is that our schools are underutilized.
Absolutely, I agree
You know,
with
because
that.
they were built for 220
Right.
kids and they've got 180 kids
Right.
in them. And it's not beyond imagining that our schools could become the place where this happens.
Right.
In this age when especially in a state like Vermont where both the husband and wife need to work,
Right.
or it's a single parent
Yeah.
and he or she needs
It's
to work.
right?
The idea of providing an aftercare program that's not just babysitting,
Right.
but is a stimulating.
And it eliminates the latchkey issue with
Yeah.
the kids being home by
Yeah, yeah.
themselves and maybe getting into some trouble with drugs, with
Right,
whatever.
right. And the governor cited data which shows that children who have access to aftercare,
Right.
after-school care, have much healthier outcomes
Right.
all the way through their adulthood
Yeah,
than those who don't. So I think it's fascinating, and one of the things that I think about a lot for when we were doing the Act 46 hearings, one of the things that was pretty powerful was that many Vermont small communities are getting smaller. They're just kind of shrinking.
they are.
And the schools have always been sort of the heart and soul of the community, the
Right.
one place where everybody came. And as the schools shrink and become more vulnerable, there's a risk of losing them, of course, and that is troubling to many. The idea that we could see schools as becoming kind of more of a community center, where, you know, why
Right.
couldn't senior citizens be meeting there for
Exactly.
lunch? Why couldn't there be a local nurse there? And so the idea of having childcare, after-school care, or just daycare
Yeah,
as part of the complex of the school facility feels to me like it could be a whole new
Yeah.
lease on life.
yep. I would
For
love
these
it. You were
institutions.
talking about senior citizens, which I am, but
Yeah.
I don't have any children. Thank you. I don't have any children in school, so you miss that connection
lose out,
with the
right,
community
right.
because we don't have a center here in Berlin. We just have the school, and so I would love to have a reason to go over there and have a place to meet.
I could
great.
see having these places sort of become energized
Yeah, right.
by serving more people, you know, so
Yeah.
that it could be a field office for a social worker from the Department of Social
Right.
Work and that sort of stuff, so that you could have access to the government services
Right.
Through this, rather than having them scattered out in suburban
absolutely.
shopping centers or
Yeah.
other places.
I think some schools are doing that, aren't they? They're
think
putting
so.
they're putting human services people
Yep.
in the schools
Yep.
because which helps deflect all that responsibility from the teachers.
Right, and
because-
the teachers can bring students with needs that were
Yeah.
under the radar to
Right.
these people. Yeah, so there's interest in going this way, and I think that the after-school program
Right.
it might be a really
Of
powerful
course,
step.
you heard the part about he said with no increase in property tax. Did you hear that part,
Yeah, I
John?
did. Well, we're just
Well, we'll just do it.
yeah.
You know.
I always say let's get the vision
Yeah, right. Then it's,
clearly committed, and then we'll figure out how to do
right.
it.
Well, I think he said some schools are doing it, and he mentioned it was Iceland that he
Yes.
was using as an
Yeah.
example of how it works well.
I have a daughter, a granddaughter, who's in school. Two of them who are in a school in Northampton, and there's an aftercare program there in the school that is run by the local YMCA.
Oh, well, there you go. Perfect.
And who cares who runs it? If they're a
Right,
competent, capable organization, let them use the space.
Yes, for sure. Well, and I think you're right. I mean, it's just being underutilized.
Yeah,
And,
especially after all the classes are out.
yeah.
You got a whole bunch of empty classrooms.
Right.
So it ought to be a slam dunk.
Do you guys say, and I forgot, I have to apologize, I forgot Tom Pelham. Tom has been a star on this show
I
for
believe it.
years
Yeah,
with his knowledge of the budget. We always drag him in here, but
Amazing.
he must love it over there with numbers every day.
Yes, on the healthcare board, right.
Oh, great! I just lost what I was going to talk about. When you got the schools there, we've been talking in town here about what to do with it and stuff like that, and it's just a great resource, and I think there's a lot of schools have things for after school, and the kids need that because to go home by themselves and not have mom and dad there, and this way, if you leave at 5, you go home to mom and dad, which is a very good thing.
Right,
That's
or
a great
to
thing.
mom, or to dad.
Or to dad,
I
yes.
mean, the number of single-parent households
Oh, yes, well, yeah.
nationwide
Yeah,
is
huge.
vastly more than it
Yeah.
was before, and we have our share of those here in Vermont.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah, if we could talk a little bit about, I don't know what the board thinks, and I should have found out about school choice. Is that something you all support or don't support?
I would say the board has, to
Not
my
taken this
knowledge,
position?
certainly not as long as I've been
Oh,
there,
okay.
has this topic come up.
Yeah,
The nearest piece about it was, before I was on the board, there was an initiative on the board to adopt new rules governing independent schools.
independent schools, right,
Okay.
which are private schools, sort of.
They are, and it's worth noting that Vermont has a long history of independent schools that have always played an important part in
Right.
in the delivery of education services for children, and they're just part of the fabric of getting children educated
Right,
in this
right.
state. And there are some folks who are hostile to independent schools. I don't know. There's some hostility among sort of the mainline teachers and perhaps even the NEA, because of course the independent schools are not organized.
Yeah, right.
And they are not subject to the same, their teachers are not subject to the same requirements for certification that public schools. So they're operating under a different set of
Okay, yeah.
rules.
And they don't, now this discussion came up last year, but I don't know what happened. There was a discussion that they had to take special ed
That's correct.
students.
That's still in the works.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Because some of them were worried that was going to, because some special ed kids can cost
Very complicated.
a huge amount of money.
Yes, yes, and so that challenge is still in the works. I think they sorted out a lot
Oh,
of that
okay.
that hasn't gone into effect
okay.
yet. So we've got this network of independent schools that do, in a way, provide a certain amount of choice. If for example, a town has no high school,
Right.
it can either designate a nearby high school, or it can say to parents, send your kid
Wherever,
anywhere you want,
right.
and we'll pay X% of the tuition. So there does exist school choice in small communities. School choice is a very interesting topic. It's sort of politically loaded. It tends to be supported by Republicans,
Right.
And it tends to be opposed by Democrats. Tends, not
Right,
it's not,
right.
but the argument against school choice is that it will leave some schools kind of emptied out. And then you have to ask yourself, well, why would that happen? And it would be because the families decided that their child could get a better education over here.
Right, right.
And then you'd have to say, well, so what's the message in that for
Right.
that school?
Yeah, right.
But on the other hand, you have to acknowledge that if you essentially it would be making sort of it a consumer choice.
Yeah.
Well, consumers don't always make the best choices. On the other hand, a classic libertarian would say, well, let
That's
them
too bad. They
figure that
decided,
out.
right, right.
And there's merit to that. I see that
Yeah.
as well. I'm not very sympathetic with the argument that, well, our public schools will have to compete. I'm sort of a traditional Vermont Republican.
Right.
I'm not a Trump Republican. I'm a Vermont Republican, which is quite different.
Different, that's different.
We would say, what's wrong with competing?
Right,
I mean,
right.
that's why we have our children on
It's
the local
healthy, we
basketball
think, right,
team. We
right,
learn from that. We win some, we lose some, we learn how to lose gracefully. All of that's
Right.
valuable. We know that means you got to get better. Getting better is a good thing.
Right.
So one of the anxieties or issues I have with government in general is that it's a monopoly.
Right.
Monopolies are famous for being ineffective and unresponsive
Right.
to what their
They're a
customers
little
want.
bloated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty encouraged about school choice. Now, I know that there are some people who are against it, but for example, I believe that the former Secretary of Education, who has declared her intention to
Oh,
run
yes,
for
right.
governor.
We're having her on the show in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, you might ask
Yeah,
her about
Rebecca.
school choice. I think she's
Yeah,
opposed
I think
to it.
she is, yeah.
But I would just note that she moved to the town I happen to live in, Norwich.
Oh,
A very expensive town to move into.
yep, right.
So not everybody has that school choice, but it has what's regarded as a very good school. So what that says is if you've got enough money, you can have school choice because you can move
Right,
where the
you want.
schools are.
Right. Well, I lived in New York City about school choice, and each of the high schools had a specialty. Like one was
Yeah.
engineering, and another one was the arts and stuff. So it was not just sort of similar but different. This was different, and so as a high schooler, you could pick
That's sort of a
what
niche.
you really
Yeah.
have to decide a little early what you like.
Yeah.
But they should be able to do that, or at least find out whether they like it or not, and then switch. But that always seemed to work really well in my mind. I knew a lot of people when I worked that had kids, and they were thrilled to death.
Well,
It
this
gave them a leg up, they thought,
Yeah.
in what they were interested
Yeah.
in.
I mean, quite apart from people's ideologies, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or independents, there is evidence that school choice is favored by a lot of people,
Yeah,
regardless of their political inclinations. One of the evidences is that if you compare property values in towns with school choice compared to towns without school choice,
Yeah. Oh, my ears are perking up. What is your answer?
the data is very clear that property values are boosted by the availability of school choice.
Serious,
Yep. And now you could say, well, how do you compare the two?
right?
It's not hard for people to correct for inherent differences in
Right.
the towns, but there's a lot of evidence that school choice essentially adds value to property. So why do property prices go up? Because more people want to be there.
Right, right.
And so if there's market demand to get into that town because my kid can go
Right,
anywhere,
right.
that tells you something that it's appealing to a lot of people. I don't know many parents who think school choice is a bad idea. I know a lot of educators who do.
Yeah. Well, I know when we were going around, I'm not going to talk about Act 46, but people were worried about the mergers, about losing school choice, and I think in most cases they worked it out. That it still remained.
Yeah,
I think that was
so.
I think I'm saying that correctly.
And conversely, actually, there are some situations where the merging of districts created school choice in the
Oh,
sense
oh,
that
that's
there
great.
might be 3 primary schools in the new district,
Right.
and the district would say you can send your child to whichever one you
Oh,
want.
perfect. Oh, that's nice.
You know, you live close to this
Yeah.
one, but it's not in your town.
Right.
So you're breaking down those barriers. So it's cut both
Because
ways.
initially, I was a little opposed to school choice because I thought, as you mentioned before, about transportation for the disadvantaged. I thought school choice would be more beneficial to kids of, more affluent families because they'd have transportation.
That's a great point, and should be a concern.
Yeah, because I've
because-
always been worried about that.
Yeah, that's a great concern, and it's solvable.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just.
Well, they do it at Rice, because a lot of
just a
people
matter
that
of
live
money.
here, their
Right.
kids go to Rice in
Right.
Burlington, and they manage to do a shared transportation,
Yeah.
pile in the car, and,
Yeah.
and this mom will take you today, and
Yeah.
so they figure that out.
Yeah,
but-
I mean, that's just a matter of a small amount of money.
Right.
That is, as they say, if your problem can be solved with money, you don't actually have a problem.
Exactly. More money and more people. That's what we always hear in state government.
Yeah.
One more topic, and then I want to let you talk about whatever we haven't covered, but homeschooling.
Yeah.
That's really on the rise, isn't it? Are the numbers on the rise? I thought I saw that.
Yeah, well, it's certainly
Or leveling off.
accelerated. Yeah. I think it's a healthy thing. It's
Yeah.
part of the, one of the things I learned from 6 years in the Senate was to value diversity. I used to love it when we would be in committee and one of the senators is a dairy farmer from a northern country,
Right.
might even appear to be not paying close attention.
Oh, yeah.
And he might not have read all the 45 pages of documentation we're supposed to read. And he'd listen to the conversation, and you'd think, oh, what's he got to add? And every once in a while, he'd pipe up and say, well, you know what I think?
Exactly. And everybody
And it would
listen.
knock our socks.
Yeah, right.
And I love that kind of diversity.
But you're going to talk about Cola Hudson's story there for a minute.
Could be, yeah, exactly. Francis Howard and
Yeah,
people
right,
like that
right.
who just brought a rich diversity to
Right.
our work. So
Down to earth, common sense,
yeah, just-
cut the mustard.
I love it on the board, our state board, when people come at it from different perspectives. It's so rich, and you just know
you, John.
you're doing way better than you could if you were just talking to people who agreed with you.
Right.
So apropos of homeschooling, it's just part of this diverse mix. I love that we have independent schools.
Yeah.
I love that we have big schools and little schools. We have urban schools and we have rural schools. And I think having schooling
good
at
for
home
you.
is an exciting part of the mix.
That's great. That's great because I know quite a few people that homeschool, and I don't see the kids seem just fine, and and because there's ways for them to be with other students
Yeah.
during the day. They can go
Wow.
and play in recess. That they all seem to be just fine.
I remember one of the most impressive classmates when I went to college was a kid who had been homeschooled for 12 years
Wow.
in Utah, in rural Utah.
Oh.
And he came to Harvard, and he was a knockout.
Wow.
And, so it just goes to show you that conscientious work by families at home can do marvelous things for
good.
children.
So I'd love to talk. We haven't had the time tonight, I don't think, but technical systems. Dave Walk and I, when I worked for him, we were so focused on using the technology that's out there to, like, you hire one Latin teacher and 5 classes can participate, and she'd go to meet the kids.
Yeah.
Do you ever talk about how to use that effectively? Because it just seems to me to be the answer, and I don't know how off base I am.
Agree. I think it could be transformative for us.
Yeah.
I mean, we suffer from our low population density
Right.
and long distances from schools,
Right.
and we don't want our kids riding for 45 minutes on a bus each way and all
Right.
that stuff. And so information transfer, fiber optics, and
Yeah, that's right.
it seems to me like it actually could be transformative for us.
I think so.
And I feel like we haven't begun to scratch the surface with this. I give you an example. I go to East Africa every year to work on some school projects there.
Wow, great.
I've been doing that since I retired 10 years ago. And in East Africa, they didn't have phones. They didn't have electricity. They skipped building, power lines
Right.
and went directly to cell phones.
That's great.
And they are better connected
Right,
by cell
right,
phones
'cause
there
up
than
on the
we are
cloud,
here.
Right. Wow.
Better. You can reach a colleague on cell phone
That's
in Kenya
funny.
better than you can here in Vermont.
Wow.
They skipped.
We still haven't finished our last mile. It's still out there.
Right, and they've skipped electricity, and they're just all got solar panels. Everybody's got a solar
that's
panel.
funny.
So what I'm saying is technology can be
Yeah,
transformative.
right.
It can allow you to leapfrog over what
Yeah.
look like demographic obstacles.
That might help you with expenses because you might not need that many more teachers because
yeah.
one could handle, 5
And-
classes, and she'd
yeah.
have to travel a little to get to know the kids.
Well, yeah, there's that, but I mean, it's happening a lot
Yeah.
in university education.
Oh, great.
And online courses at universities are now very common.
Yep.
And there's, from what I've heard about some of them, they're very demanding. And you really get to know
Yeah,
your
right.
people. You're expected to be there online every
Wow.
time.
Accountability, John.
100% attention.
Excellent.
It's pretty exciting
Thank
stuff.
you. Listen, we have 1 minute and 24 seconds. Is there anything you'd like to tell folks about education in Vermont? And
Well, I guess
Not
I'd
to
have
worry.
to say, I had a very fascinating conversation a week ago with 10 school superintendents. And we sat down and I asked them, what are the three biggest challenges facing education
Right.
over the next 20 years?
Right.
And of the 6 things that were identified by this group, only one of them was actually something that educators could do anything about, and it was school curriculums are so different all around the state. We ought to move
Right.
toward a common curriculum. Only one. All the other stuff was our fragile economy,
Yeah. Oh.
our declining demographics, our very rural, dispersed, shrinking rural
Right.
communities, things that frankly educators can do nothing about, but which have significant
Right.
cause significant constraints upon their ability to deliver a high performance education. So it was really striking that a lot
Interesting.
of this stuff is what you'd call external to
Right,
education,
right.
but it has a huge impact. Another one, by the way, was our deep tradition to local control.
Yeah, we call it local influence in our town because you don't really have
You
control.
don't really have
Yeah,
control.
no, you don't. You have control over what's being built and not built, but you don't have control over
right.
the basic stuff.
Yeah, indeed.
John, we've run out of time. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
I hope when we get our final ruling, maybe you or somebody from the board could
Yeah.
come and sort it out for us.
Be happy to do so.
Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.